Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Israel, the plucky nation surrounded by hostile Arab states, has every right to defend itself. And much of the criticism thrown at it is unfortunately motivated by spite, worse still, anti-Semitism. No other democratic state gets the same level of vitriol as the Jewish state. At least that's the thesis of many supporters of Israel. Today, our guest, Professor Avi Shlaim, an Israeli Jew born in Baghdad, has a very different take on Israel's history, as well as the criticism made of it. And that's what we're going to discuss here today. Hello and welcome, Avi.
Hello, good evening, Nicholas. Hello to everybody. Very nice to be in touch with all of you, wherever you are.
We've got an audience in the US, Australia, and here in the UK. So it's we've got good morning, good evening, and whatever time of day it is. And here I have to say where we are, it's the weather is all over the place. So I don't know where we stand. It's been snowing today and the daffodils are out too. Anyway, this is of course an opportunity for us to learn about your views, Avi, and to get a different take on Israel's history. But also it's an opportunity for us to learn a bit about you. For those that don't know you, you're an emeritus professor of international relations at Oxford University, famed for your books on Israel as well as Jordan. And before we sort of get into the debates and the history, can you just tell us a bit about your own life? As I mentioned, you were born in Baghdad. How did you come to Israel and then the UK?
I've just finished writing a memoir about my early life. It's called Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew. And it goes up to the age of 18. And it's already about 300 pages long. So I could tell you in great detail, but I won't. So just very briefly, the three worlds of the title are my life in Baghdad between 1945 and 1950, when we moved to Israel. We were a Jewish family in Baghdad. We moved to Israel when I was 5 years old. It was a huge upheaval for the whole family and the whole Jewish community. It was like we were uprooted and ended up in Israel. Then the second world is Israel at school from the age of 5 to the age of 15. I was a very poor student at school, and I failed English outright, and that would have been the end of my education. So my parents sent me to school in London. And the third world is going to a Jewish school in London from the age of 15 to 18. So that, in broad outline, is my life. But you would have noticed that there are two major upheavals. First, from Iraq, an Arab country where we spoke Arabic, to Israel. I had to learn a new country and adjust to a completely different society. And then at the age of 15, another upheaval and another totally different society that I had to adjust to. And the theme of my memoir is Memoir of an Arab Jew, because an Arab Jew is a very controversial concept in Israel today, because there is a dichotomy in everything. There is an Arab-Israeli conflict. So in Israel today, you can say you are a Romanian Jew or a French Jew or even a German Jew, despite the associations between Germany and the Holocaust. But you can't say you're an Arab Jew. That's considered an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. If you are a Jew, you can't be an Arab, and if you are an Arab, you cannot be a Jew. But there is no better way to describe the identity of my family and my initial identity. It was that of an Arab Jew. We were a Jewish family in an Arab country, living very comfortably, very happily, at complete peace and harmony with our neighbors. And we were Arab Jews. until the rise of nationalism in the 20th century, Arab nationalism on the one hand, Jewish nationalism or Zionism on the other hand, the clash between the two, the conflict in Palestine, and it was these conflicting nationalism that made coexistence between Muslims and Jews impossible.
You said you weren't a great student, but you spoke Hebrew, and I think your parents spoke Arabic at home. And I think you're a patriot, weren't you? You truly believed in your country, and you believed that it was standing up against its enemies. You're surrounded by enemies.
Yes, I believe that because I was indoctrinated in Israel. At school, we were taught history of the Jewish people, and we weren't taught anything about the history of the Jews in the Arab world, only about the history of the Jews in Europe. And it's what the version I was taught at school is what the American Jewish historian Salo Baron once called the lachrymose version of Jewish history. The lachrymose version of Jewish history says that the Jews everywhere were always persecuted, harassed, discriminated against, suffered pogroms, and this history of violence and hostility towards the Jews culminated in the Holocaust. And I accept this. My field isn't Jewish history, but as a fair representation of Jewish history up to 1948. But I cannot accept it as a fair representation of Arab-Jewish relations since 1948.
Avi, at what point then did you begin to change your mind? You moved to the UK, you studied at an English school, and then I think you went to, where did you go to university after that?
Well, between school and university, I did 2 years military service in the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. And I was indoctrinated there as well. And I believed everything that I was taught, that I was told in the army, that we were a small, peace-loving country, a decent country, surrounded by Arab predators who were determined to throw us into the sea, and we had to stand up and fight. And I remember the induction ceremony. I was 18 years old. It was in the twilight on a plateau in the Judean hills, and we all swore loyalty to the state. The flag was waved, and we shouted in unison, "In blood and fire, Judea fell. In blood and fire, Judea will rise again." I didn't have the slightest doubt that we were in the right, and we were defending ourselves, and all of Israel's previous wars had been defensive wars, not offensive wars. So I never questioned the Zionist narrative. But when I finished military service, a few days later, after I was demobbed, I turned up at Jesus College, Cambridge, as a first-year student in history. And a new chapter in my life began. I was still an Israeli patriot. In the summer term of 1967, my first year, in May, a crisis erupted, which ended up in what became the Six-Day War. And everyone thought that Israel was about to be annihilated, that there would be a second Holocaust. And I believe that too. Israel was surrounded. And I went down to the Israeli embassy, and I said I wanted to serve in the war. And they took my contact details, and they said, if we want you, we'll call you, we'll contact you. And I never heard from them again. And the war was over in 6 days, and it ended with a spectacular Israeli military victory. I may add, this was the only tutorial that I missed in 3 years as a student at Cambridge, because Oxford and Cambridge students are essay writing machines. And for 3 years, every week I had to write an essay for my tutor. And that was the only time I had to reschedule a tutorial, and my tutor was very sympathetic. But that was the turning point. Israel's spectacular victory in the Six-Day War. Now, my change of views didn't happen suddenly, but very gradually. But looking back, the transformation amounted to this. In my time in the army, the IDF was true to its name. It was the Israel Defense Force to defend Israel against attacks by the Arabs. After 1967, Israel trebled its territory. It captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank from Jordan. And Israel became a colonial power. And my little army was transformed from the Israel Defense Force into the brutal colonial power, colonial police force of a brutal colonial power, an occupying power.
So I guess that from Israel's argument, and then you know it well, is that it needs this territory in order to defend itself, because otherwise it would be left with such a tiny slice of territory, it would be very difficult to defend, and therefore the Golan Heights, the West Bank, are all necessary there. And the exception was the Sinai Peninsula, which was traded in an agreement with Sadat in 1979. But the rest is there as a buffer. Now, I know we've seen that change, and that Netanyahu and that certainly the right wing within Israel have become more and more in favor of annexation, certainly parts of the West Bank, and they've announced those plans already. But you can understand that there have been many sympathizers throughout the world who'd say, look, Israel is surrounded by these enemies, and this, you can completely understand how its military stance, also its territorial stance, is necessitated by its geographical position and the failure of its neighbors to accept its existence.
I completely reject this logic, and it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. After the Six-Day War, there was a formula for resolving the conflict. It was UN Resolution 242, which was a package deal, land for peace. Israel would give back the occupied territories in return for peace with the Arabs. Whenever Israel put this formula to the test, it worked. In 1979, Israel agreed to give back Sadat the whole of the Sinai Peninsula in return for peace. And he insisted it had to be every inch. Once Israel conceded the principle of returning the land to the Egyptians, it got a peace agreement which, despite all the crises and turmoil, is still standing today. In 1994, Israel signed a peace treaty with Jordan. It resolved the territorial issue in the south, and there is still peace between Israel and Jordan. So if since 1967, Israel had a choice. It could have land or it could have peace, but it couldn't have both. So with Egypt and Jordan, it traded land for peace, but with the Palestinians, it refused to trade land for peace. And the proof of that is that in July, the Six-Day War ended on the 11th of June 1967. In July, Israel built the first settlement on the West Bank. Now, settlements, civilian settlements on occupied territory is a breach of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention says you can't transfer your civilian population to occupied area. So civilian settlements on the West Bank and Gaza is about land grabbing. Land grabbing and peacemaking don't go together. It's one or the other. And Israel has been expanding settlements ever since July 1967. And that's the proof that it is not interested in peace with the Palestinians, or at least that it's not prepared to pay the price for peace with the Palestinians, which is an end of occupation.
Okay. I think we're getting to sort of the core of the argument, which makes you a thorn in the side for many supporters of Israel, and also many of the statements that you make cause some of them offense, to the extent, you know, when you say that Israel is an ethnocracy, essentially that is a racist state, and a state in which the Jews have a superior status, and the whole state essentially is founded upon this basis. And many people would level the accusation, would call you, they would say they would say you are anti-Semitic. It's difficult for them to do so because you're both Israeli and Jewish. But that's nevertheless, if I were to say, look, Israel is a racist state, or an apartheid state, or an ethnocracy, I would be accused of anti-Semitism.
Well, I have news for you, and that is that Israel is officially a racist state. And this may surprise you, and it may surprise a lot of apologists for Israel. But if you look at Israel within its original borders, pre-1967 borders, it's a democracy. It's a procedural democracy, at any rate. There are political parties, there are elections, and there is a government which is accountable to the Knesset. And the Arabs within Israel, there are about 1.8 million Palestinian Israelis. They are a fifth of the population. 4/5 are Jews, a fifth are Palestinian Israelis. So they have the vote. But since 1967, Israel has ruled over the West Bank and Gaza. Then in 2005, Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza. So we are talking about the whole area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And it's one regime, one state, one power that is in charge and rules over, has completely unlimited control over this whole area, which contains about 5 million Palestinians in the occupied territories. And these 5 million Palestinians have no political rights. And it's an apartheid regime, because on the West Bank, there are a lot of settlements, and there are roads that lead to the settlements and between them. Palestinians are not allowed to use the, I was going to say, white roads only, but it's settlers' roads only. Palestinians are not allowed to use them. And there are two judicial systems. Israelis come under Israeli civilian courts, but Palestinians are tried in Israeli military courts. So two judicial systems, two different roads. One, the Jewish population have every privilege and the vote, whereas the Palestinians don't have the vote. They don't have any say in the rule over them. And if that's not apartheid, I don't know what is. And recently, the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, issued a report. And in the past, this is a very well-respected, honest human rights organization. In the past, B'Tselem used to be critical only of the occupation and the abuses of human rights in the occupied territories. But in this last report, the title is something like Jewish Supremacy or Jewish Supremacist Regime, this is apartheid. And it said, we can no longer distinguish between the West Bank and Israel. It's one unit with one government, with one rule, with two classes of citizens, and this is apartheid. Now, I began to answer your question by saying that Israel is officially a racist state. So this was my view all along, that Israel is an apartheid regime. But in July 2018, the Knesset, the parliament, passed the nation-state law. This is a basic law. Israel doesn't have a written constitution, but it has two categories of laws, regular laws, ordinary laws, everything, and some basic laws which define the character of the state. And the 2018 nation-state law says that the Jews have a unique right to national self-determination, a unique right, which means an exclusive right. So that creates two classes of citizens within Israel proper, not between Israel and the occupied territories. Within Israel proper, only the Jews have the right to national self-determination. So by its own basic law, Israel is an apartheid state.
Okay, we sent out your article in which you explained these points very clearly, and it's worth going back to have a look at that. I do want to encourage people to start putting their questions now in the Q&A box. If you're looking at a laptop, it's on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. I think if you're looking at an iPad, it might be on the top right, but do start putting your questions in the Q&A box. Avi, I mean, I think you've made your argument, very clearly. If you talked about the 2018 Basic Law, which states Israel as a nation of the Jewish people and essentially relegates non-Jews to sort of second-class status. You talked also about B'Tselem's recent report, in which they say the entire area Israel controls between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is governed by a single regime working to advance and perpetuate the supremacy of one group over another. Those points are very well argued, but one cannot but help think of the Palestinian political response to Israel over the last 2 decades and longer. One can look at Hamas, an Islamist organization that is certainly not democratic in Gaza. It's repressive in many ways, and its interaction with Israel is one of violence. We can look at the PLO itself. We can look in the Second Intifada, where the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades were carrying out attacks against Israel. Palestinians are regularly involved in knife attacks, in cars driving, basically essentially terrorism, running people down in the streets of Jerusalem. So this is the security context through which, the prism through which most Israelis see the Palestinians, and also the prism through which much of the world sees the Palestinians' relationship with Israel. So to that extent, you could quite easily understand why Israel is so loath to give these communities the rights that you say they deserve.
You're right in saying that this is how Israelis see themselves. They see themselves as being under attack and threatened and the victims. And you're also right in saying that this is how most of the world sees Israel and the Palestinians. because the Zionist narrative is dominant at home and abroad. But this narrative is false, it's fundamentally inaccurate. And to just give two examples from what you said about the Palestinian threat to Israel, the second Intifada started in 2000. How did it start? It started with Ariel Sharon, the leader of the Likud, the leader of the opposition, going on a walkabout in East Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem, around Al-Aqsa, so, accompanied by 1,000 security men. This was a deliberate and open provocation, and it started with some stone throwing and escalated. So Israel provoked the second Intifada, which lasted for 5 years. And you said to me that Hamas is certainly not democratic. Well, there is the Hamas Charter, which is not just not democratic, it's anti-Semitic. It's a very, very crude document, and it denies the Jews any national rights in Palestine. It calls for a single Islamic state over the whole of mandatory Palestine. But this is the document, very unfortunate document, but the Hamas political leadership is much more pragmatic, and in a series of statements, they made it clear that they would settle for a two-state solution along the 1967 borders. And in and they chose not violence, but the parliamentary road to power. And Hamas formed as a political party, and there was an all-Palestinian elections on the West Bank and Gaza in January 2006. Hamas ran for election against Fatah, which is the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas won an absolute and clear majority. This was, there were 200 international monitors. They all said the same thing. This was an orderly, peaceful, clean election. The Carter Center monitored the election, and Jimmy Carter, I met him when he came to collect his honorary degree from Oxford, and he said to me, this was one of the most peaceful, free and fair elections he had ever attended anywhere. The West says they believe in democracy. Here there was democracy in action, and the people spoke, and they voted for Hamas. Israel refused to recognize the elections. Israel refused to deal with the Hamas-led government, although it was a moderate government which called for a long-term ceasefire with Israel, negotiations for a long-term ceasefire. And European Union and the United States, to their eternal shame, backed Israel in refusing to recognize the results of a democratic election and joined Israel in economic warfare to undermine the Hamas government. And there was a conspiracy. I use the word deliberately because I've seen the documents, the Palestine papers that were released. They show that there was a conspiracy between Israel, between the American general who was training the Palestinian Authority forces, the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, and Egyptian intelligence. There was a plot to isolate, weaken, and drive Hamas out of power. And there was going to be a Fatah coup and against Hamas, and Hamas preempted by seizing power violently in Gaza. This was in June 2007. Immediately after that, after it seized power, Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza, which is still in force today. So Gaza is under blockade. A blockade is a form of collective punishment which is proscribed under international law. So here are two examples of how my narrative, and I'm a historian and I've studied this subject, completely contradicts the dominant Zionist narrative, which is widely accepted around the world.
Thank you very much, Avi, for this introduction so far. Let's begin to take some questions now. I'm going to start with Simon Jackson first, because I think it's a good question, and I'll come to Hilary Matthews afterwards. So go ahead, Simon.
The present Palestinian strategy, assuming there is one, doesn't seem to be working. What might?
Avi, I'm just going to add to that. This predicates that there is a possible two-state solution in the offing, and that obviously what the Palestinian Authority would want. But there are also the many people who basically say the two-state solution is dead, and essentially Israel's not interested anyway either.
Yes. So there is a Palestinian Authority. The last elections was about 11 years ago, even more. There is now preparations for another election. So the present government, the present Palestinian Authority, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, lacks legitimacy. And there will be an election in May. What is the strategy of the Palestinian Authority? It doesn't have much of a strategy. It has an aim. The aim is an independent Palestinian state along the in Gaza and the West Bank, with a capital city in East Jerusalem. That's the aim of the Palestinian Authority, but it's nowhere near achieving it. There isn't the slightest prospect of achieving this goal. And in the meantime, the Palestinian Authority cooperates with Israel on security matters. And this undermines further its legitimacy, because a lot of Palestinians, especially the younger generation, see the Palestinian Authority as a collaborationist regime, as a subcontractor for Israeli security on the West Bank. So the Palestinian Authority is going nowhere. Hamas has a different strategy, which is resistance. Hamas is the only serious Palestinian element that calls for resistance to the Israeli occupation. So you have Hamas, which stands for resistance, but is incarcerated and neutralized in Gaza. And you have the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, which is completely impotent. It's also corrupt and inefficient, and therefore unpopular. Now, to come to the second part of the question, the one posed by Nicholas about the two-state solution, people have been talking about a two-state solution to this conflict ever since 1967. There is the broadest international consensus for a two-state solution. The problem is that Israel is not interested, wouldn't allow a Palestinian state. Israel is not prepared to withdraw to the 67 borders. And now Israel, the Likud, Netanyahu, openly say that they're opposed, totally opposed to a Palestinian state anywhere, and that the Israeli expansion on the West Bank continues. So I would say there was a two-state solution at once upon a time, and Israel has killed it by its policy of territorial expansion and expanding its settlements, the creeping annexation of the West Bank. And Israel also built the so-called security barrier on the West Bank, which is illegal. And that is also about land grabbing. So as a result of Israel's actions, the two-state solution is no longer a viable solution. I have said that the two-state solution is as dead as a dodo. It's as dead as the Oxford dodo, which before lockdown I used to visit regularly in the Natural History Museum. So where do we go from now? What is the solution? Many people, myself included, have given up on the two-state solution and said the only solution is one state, one democratic state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or gender.
So, Avi, just to follow up on Simon's question, is there anything that the Palestinian Authority can do effectively to achieve a two-state solution at this stage? You'll say that basically it's just not a possibility at all. I mean, is there any? Can you suggest alternative strategies that might give them more leverage?
No, because Israel has so much power, and Israel holds all the cards, and they have no leverage in dealing with Israel. In 1993, the PLO signed the Oslo Accord with Israel. And I was euphoric because I thought, this is it, this is the real deal. There would be a lot of arguments, a lot of pushing and shoving, but this is the beginning of solution of the 100-year conflict. That Oslo would start, it had its limitations, it was a modest step in the right direction, but I thought it would generate a dynamic of gradual, controlled Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, and at the end of the process, there would be an independent Palestinian state. But it was not to be, because Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish fanatic because he was giving land back to the Palestinians. There was an election. Benjamin Netanyahu won the election in 1996 by a margin of less than 1%, but he and the Likud never liked Oslo. Once he got into power, he immediately dismantled the Oslo Accords. And so this could have been the beginning of something that would lead to a two-state solution, but Israel scuppered it. And if you press me to say in one word, why did the Oslo peace process break down? The Israelis would say it's Palestinian violence. And I would say, no, it's that Israel, under the Likud, under Netanyahu, reneged on the Oslo deal and continued to steal more and more Palestinian territory. That's why the peace process broke down.
Okay, I'm going to chop and change a bit more of these questions. Really good questions coming in, but I'm going to change the order in which they've come. So let's take Nigel Harley next. So Nigel, go ahead. Nigel.
Yes, I mean, my point is that despite only representing about 2.5% of the US population, the Jewish lobby have had enormous influence on American foreign policy as it regards to the Middle East. However, that population of about 7.5 million appears to be aging. So therefore, there could be a change or there should be a loss of influence. And what do you feel the consequences of that might be?
Avi, they're actually also becoming more liberal, the actual Jewish population is, but I guess the other factor is the evangelical community in the States.
Yes, so the Jews in America are less than 3% of the population. Now, numerically, they're insignificant. But they're a major force in American politics, especially in the Democratic Party, and they're influential in the media. And there is the Israel lobby, AIPAC, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee. That's the most powerful foreign policy lobby in America. And as you said, it has influence not just over Israel and Israel-Palestine, but the lobby has profound interest over the whole range of American policies towards the Middle East. The trend is towards the decline of the influence of the Israel lobby in America, because the younger generation of Americans are not beholden to Israel. They find Israel as an embarrassment. They genuinely believe in democracy. They see Israel as a colonial power. They want Israel to respect Palestinian human rights, to end the occupation, and a two-state solution. And they have an organization, it's called J Street. That's a liberal organization. One expert on the subject estimates that 70% of American Jews identify with the J Street position, and only about 30%, the older generation of Americans, still support AIPAC. But AIPAC still has much more power. But I'm elaborating on this because Jewish position on Israel is changing against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians. And American public opinion is changing. It's much more sympathetic towards the Palestinians. And in the long run, this will influence official policy. But there is another factor in this that Nicholas mentioned. The American Christian Zionists or evangelists. There are millions and millions of them. They are the backbone of the Republican Party. And they have a literal interpretation of the scripture. They think that the Messiah will come. There will be the Battle of Armageddon, and a lot of Jews would die, and the others that remained will be converted to Christianity. For this, because of their religious convictions, they support Israel all the way. And they supported Trump. They voted for Trump, they supported him, and that's why Trump was so pro-Israeli, so unbelievably pro-Israeli. It wasn't in order to court the Jewish vote, it's in order to please his constituency, the evangelicals, and that isn't going to change in the foreseeable future. So I think the Israel lobby in America will continue to exercise very disproportionate influence on American foreign policy.
I'm going to take two questions here and combine them back to back. So let's take Pamela Dixon first, and then Paul Davis. So Pamela Dixon first, please.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for your talk so far. I wanted to ask you, to what degree do you think that Israel's policies at this point are supporting or in agreement with the Orthodox community in Israel, as opposed to many of the secular community, many of the secular Israelis who seem to, many of them support compromise with the Palestinians? At this point, has Israel, or is it becoming a theocracy?
I'm going to get Paul Davis's question too. So go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk and for allowing me to ask the question. Proportional representation, as it is in Israel, tends to give small parties excessive amount of control in coalitions. And I wondered how you saw that being able to be changed in their current system of government, and more importantly, other than an outright majority, how can that be managed?
Great questions there. Avi, as far as I'm aware, peace is a dirty word for most secular Israelis, religious or not. it's peace went out the window some time ago. But there is the questions about Israel's sort of political makeup, proportional representation, and the power of small parties is the key thing here, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, two very good questions. And for the last 20 years, the Israeli public has been moving steadily to the right. Ever since the second Intifada, the Israeli public has been moving steadily to the right. But there are deep cleavages inside Israel. You mentioned one, the religious Jews and the secular Jews. The religious Jews are growing in number. They tend to have, secular Jews have on average 2 children, whereas the Orthodox Jews have much larger families, sometimes with about 10 children. So the number of religious Jews has been growing, and not one but 3 religious parties, and they have a lot of influence, and they're all hawkish on foreign policy, anti-Palestinian, anti-peace. So they make natural coalition partners to the Likud because they agree on the program of preserving the status quo and expanding settlements and giving privileges to the Jews. Now, to turn to Paul's question, Israel has a system of proportional representation, the most perfect system of proportional representation anywhere in the world. So there are no constituencies. The whole of the country is one constituency, and you don't have your own MP as in Britain. You vote for a party list. Every party has a list of candidates, and if it wins 20 seats in the Knesset, the first 20 people on its list will become members of the Knesset. And this encourages the proliferation of small parties. And in the last election, the 4th one in 2 years, in the last election, there were 29 parties running for election.
They have to reach a 2% threshold, don't they, Avi?
3.25.
3.25. And it's interesting that quite a few Arab Israelis or Palestinians don't vote, do they? I mean, they represent 20% of the population, but they've only got about sort of 12% in parliament. Is that right?
Yes, exactly right. But something has happened to the Arab vote. In the previous election, there was the joint list, which was an amalgam of 3 Arab parties into one joint list, and they won 15 seats in the Knesset. But Netanyahu, who is a very, very clever tactician, played divide and rule and managed to split them. By making promises to the Islamic faction within this party. So the leader, Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Islamic faction, ran as an independent party, and it looked as if he may not have passed the threshold, but he did, and they have 4 or 5 seats, and the other part of the previous joint lists have 9 seats. So they have 13 or 14 seats in the Knesset, but they are not one.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to come back and do another session on Israel's elections, because Israeli politics is pretty complicated, and I think its move to the right is key in understanding Israel's approach to the West Bank, and there are many, many reasons behind that. There's the Russian sort of East Europeans, the population growing within Israel, and the Mizrahi Jews, people of Arab descent, who tend to be more right-wing as well. So there are multiple layers. And I think we'll come back to this. And Dalia Scheindlin, who is the person we regularly talk to about Israeli politics, is possibly the best person to come back and answer some of those questions. So we'll get more into that later. But I think there are a couple of other things I want to sort of come back to, Avi. And one is this definition we talked about briefly in the previous discussion, the definition of anti-Semitism, which you have criticized heavily for shutting down criticism of Israel. And I want you to talk briefly about that. And then also, I just want to come back to this question: is US policy on Israel changing? We've got a new administration. The Biden administration certainly does not like Benjamin Netanyahu. The phone call. Normally, there's a phone call pretty quickly soon after inauguration between Tel Aviv and Washington, or Jerusalem and Washington now, and that didn't take place. So I'm interested to get your take on US relations, possibly deal with that first, and then we'll come on to the definition of anti-Semitism that we've spoken about in our previous session as well.
Okay, so we have a new administration after Trump, whose policy towards Israel and Palestine just checked the wish list of the Israeli right. He gave the Israeli right everything they ever asked for, everything they ever dreamt of. So he recognized Israeli sovereignty over the whole of Jerusalem and moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He closed down the PLO office in Washington, D.C. He closed down the American consulate in East Jerusalem, which was in effect the embassy for dealing with the Palestinians. He cut off all American funding to UNRWA, the UN agency that looks after refugees, and he stopped American economic aid to the Palestinian Authority. And now, so no one could have been more pro-Israeli than Trump. And Trump also had what he called the deal of the century, which gave Israel a free pass to formally annex a third of the West Bank. But even Netanyahu doesn't want to formally annex. He's happy with the status quo. So there is a new administration, but it only changed marginally the previous Republican policy towards Israel-Palestine. So they restored aid to UNRWA, they restored economic aid to the Palestinian Authority, they allow the PLO to reopen their office in Washington, D.C. I think they plan to reopen the American Consulate General in East Jerusalem, but they are still very, very one-sided in support of Israel. It's still a very pro-Israeli administration. And it reverted to the only formula they know, which is a two-state solution, which, as I was saying earlier, is pie in the sky. It's not a realistic basis for a solution.
Avi, what I find amazing is we can have these conversations here, and as you say, you are the exception, not the rule. The generally accepted views of Israel are, the opposite to what you describe. Criticism of Israel, as we said at the beginning of this program, is generally seen as being, as taboo. So that brings us on to the question of the Holocaust Memorial's definition of anti-Semitism and the 11 examples. Now, we discussed this in a difficult conversation, I would say, we had about a month and a half ago. But can you just briefly say how you think it shuts down criticism of Israel and how you think that's not legitimate?
It's difficult to do it briefly because it's a very murky area, but I'll try. So I assume people know what the IHRA or IRA definition is. There is a definition which is two sentences, which is completely vacuous and meaningless. It says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, but it doesn't say what the perception is. So it's completely meaningless. And the second part gives 11 examples of what might constitute anti-Semitism, and 7 of those relate to Israel. And Israel's friends, American Zionists, have been pushing for this definition all the time, from the beginning. And the IRA body wouldn't accept the 11 examples as part of the definition. So they had to be separated, and the definition that was adopted by IRA is only the 2 vacuous sentences which are meaningless. But for Israel friends, what matters is the 11 examples, because they describe as anti-Semitic almost any kind of criticism of Israel. But Israel's friends have deliberately misled the public, deliberately falsely claimed that the examples are part of the definition. They are not.
So I want to give a good example of how this is shut down debate. And you wrote about this in a recent article. You talked about the film director, it's just gone from my head now, the famous film director who's coming to St. Peter's College.
Oh, yes, Ken Loach.
And St. Peter's were roundly condemned for him just talking about his films. It wasn't talking about Israel, the fact that he appeared and gave a talk about the films.
And he was attacked for having made statements that are anti-Semitic under the IRA definition.
Ken Loach, sorry.
Ken Loach. And he's not anti-Semitic in any way. He's left-wing. He's been struggled. He's been an opponent of racism of any kind throughout his career. He's a defender of minority rights and of human rights. He's a very humane, liberal person, in no way anti-Semitic. The case against him by various Jewish groups was that his comments were anti-Semitic under the IRA definition, where they are, but that's not a proper definition. And it's curious that a definition of anti-Semitism says so much about Israel. Because Israel is a state, it's a sovereign state, whereas the Jews are not a state, they are a religion. One of the examples of racism is to call Israel a racist endeavor. And I've already said earlier that Israel defines itself as a racist state and as an apartheid state. So why shouldn't anyone say it's a racist state? In Israel, people say that all the time, and no one says they're anti-Semitic.
I have to say, Avi, it's such a difficult subject. I mean, I have sympathized with you on many of the things you say, but I think people dare not say it because they will have the label of anti-Semitism leveled at them, and in my view, illegitimately. I'd love to get some more questions from people along those lines. I can see people here who are watching this who do have opinions that might not be be the same as Avi's and not the same as mine either. So I'm very keen to get any more comments or other questions that people can throw in. We've got a few more minutes left. Avi, I do want to come back to the question of peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. And I'd like to take a question from Sheila de Balague. So Sheila, go ahead, please. Sheila, are you there? Yep, you're there.
Sorry, I opened my video instead of my other thing. Anyway, I wanted to say that can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah. The one state solution that you favor, Professor Shlaim, with equal rights for everyone, every citizen, seems like an impossible dream. How could it be brought about?
Avi, I would chime in with that. It would seem I think about in the United States, I think about, if you think about apartheid, or if you think about race laws, and how many years, how many decades or centuries it's taken the US to tackle that question and still dealing with it. It would seem to me that Israel's legacy and division with the Palestinians is going to be with us for, possibly over a century.
So the one-state solution isn't a realistic prospect in the foreseeable future, but it's the right solution, the moral solution. It's a noble vision. What could be nobler than two communities that have suffered a great deal coming together and having equal rights? No one could object ideologically to this vision. But as you're saying, there are all sorts of practical obstacles, mostly that Israel wouldn't allow it to come about. So how could we achieve that? The answer is it's not possible to achieve it in the short run or even the medium term. And salvation isn't going to come from Western governments, because the European governments and America are beholden to Israel, and they will continue to support Israel. Look at Britain, for example, which is responsible for the loss of Palestine, and yet it's entirely pro-Israeli and doesn't care at all about Palestinian rights. So the only hope of change lies in civil society, in organizations like the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, in the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, which is a non-violent grassroots movement which is gaining more and more support throughout the world. So public opinion is changing towards equal rights for the Palestinians. And I'll give you one more example of how the context is changing and public opinion might be changing as a result. And that's the International Criminal Court's decision to launch a full-scale investigation of war crimes in the occupied territories. So this was a decision by the International Criminal Court to investigate Israeli and Hamas war crimes. And Netanyahu immediately dismissed this as pure anti-Semitism. It's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's a judgment by a court to launch an investigation. So the International Criminal Court cannot force Israel to withdraw. It doesn't have powers of enforcement, but it has symbolic power or rhetorical power. It influences public opinion. And it may well rule, issue a report which condemns Israel of war crimes, and this will generate more sympathy for the Palestinians. So we shouldn't underestimate the symbolic importance of judgments like that of the ICC. How was apartheid in South Africa defeated? It wasn't defeated on the battlefield. White South Africa was much stronger than the opposition. The Palestinians have no chance in hell of defeating Israel on the battlefield. But they can win the battle for the hearts and minds of people. And I think that in the 21st century, apartheid is not sustainable in the long run. So although at the moment I don't see any possibility of a straightforward move towards a one-state solution, I remain optimistic in the long term that apartheid cannot last.
My thanks to Professor Avi Shlaim for his contributions. It's been a really, really good discussion so far.